it just makes me wonder, what was the point of a good portion of this film? Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of A Lost Plot, the podcast by storytellers for storytellers, so that we can tell better stories ourselves. As always, I'm your host, Maverick, and today we have back with us our co-host, Andrew, to review the second installment in the Matrix franchise. That's right, we're talking about The Matrix Reloaded, the 2003 American science fiction action film, which was, again, written and directed by the Wachowski brothers. Yeah, at the time, anyways. Andrew, what is your initial thoughts and rating for The Matrix Reloaded?
I liked it better than the first one. My overall rating was a 7.3.
Okay, there you go. That's pretty good. I am not going to lie. I am very surprised that you got that rating for this one. I personally am curious to see how the next one progresses then for you. I personally think this one is my least favorite of all of the Matrix movies that I've seen so far. Granted, I will say I've not seen the last Matrix, the Matrix Revolutions, I believe it is. Anyways, the last one that came out a couple years ago, I have not seen the fourth Matrix. But of the three original trilogy Matrix films, this is my least favorite. I think that there is a lot of reasons why this thing takes some of the slighter, bigger problems with the first one and makes them even worse. Except for one thing that they do very well in this film, and we will get to that. But with all of that being said, my rating was a 3.1. So we'll get into exactly where we get this discrepancy today, but of course, for you who are watching and have not actually watched the film, we did give you that background. So, Andrew, what is The Matrix Reloaded all about?
It picks up, I think, roughly like a year after the first one.
It's 6 months, yeah.
Okay, 6 months, cool. It follows Neo, Trinity, Morpheus as humanity's last city, Zion, as they're trying to prepare for this massive machine invasion. Neo is struggling with these visions he's getting of Trinity falling to her death, as well as his role as the One, if you will. As the movie progresses, he tries to seek answers inside the Matrix, and he starts to encounter programs. Agent Smith, I believe, is one of their names. He runs into the Oracle again, and then he meets the Architect towards the end, who reveals that the prophecy of the One is just like this repeating cycle of control that is necessary to keep the Matrix alive. By the end of the movie, he's now faced with a choice between saving Trinity or Zion as a city of people. He's told by the Oracle that if he saves her, then Zion is going to be basically destroyed and then reborn, and he's going to be given like a harem of people to go and repopulate. And then he rejects this notion, decides to save Trinity, and the movie's left off with us not knowing what the butt's going to happen next.
And for those of you who are curious, this is clearly one that is made with the intention of the next one preceding it, similar to some of these other movies that you watch, Lord of the Rings or the Avengers Infinity War series, any number of these that come out, and there's clearly supposed to be another film that comes after it. This is definitely how this one was created, and they had a quick turnaround for that. I will just note that the next installment for this series came out 6 months after this one came out in the same year. So they had these ones in the barrel. They were ready to go, back to back with that. So stay tuned. We will get to the third one when that comes around. But let's start off with the Reloaded episode 2 today. We start off with that opening scene where you get this dream that Neo is having about Trinity dying, and then he wakes up and he sees that he's back on the Nebuchadnezzar with Morpheus and Trinity and all of the good old crew, with a few extras brought in, including Link, who replaces Tank and Dozer from the last film as the people who drives the ship. All of these people come around and they get they get basically ported back into the Matrix for an emergency meeting where they get everyone who infiltrates the Matrix, who is part of this resistance, is all together in this single meeting, and they find out that that Zion has been found by the enemy, and they are trying to dig down and destroy it, and they have to basically all go back home and try to save Zion before it gets destroyed. What are your thoughts on the opening of this film?
I think his vision of Trinity kind of sets the stage for what he's going to be struggling with for the rest of the film. It's like sets you right into the action. It's like very Anakin-esque in this film. He's like having visions of losing a loved one. Not quite as satisfying, if I might say, as Anakin's visions and his dealing with those visions, but I mean, you pretty much give him a struggle right from the get-go with this film. Like you're not waiting to set up tensions for him, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely see that from the start. They're trying to deal with the idea of him struggling with his love interest and the concern that she might die. And of course, the Anakin comparison is pretty apt, as you see that as a concern in a similar fashion, where they're having these premonitions about what is going to happen. And this is something that terrifies him as he moves forward into the film. You see that Neo is reintroduced. Do you think that he's introduced as a compelling protagonist in this film?
I don't know that I really see him change throughout the film, if that's what you're asking. I think they're kind of going for the white knight, if you will, in this film, where he is faced with impossible decisions and must choose anyways. I think the struggle in reviewing this film, which the second one will probably heavily influence what the final rating would be for this one, is just we don't see the end of this arc for Neo because we don't see the consequences of his actions. And so it's very incomplete. And I had this same discussion on movies, most recently probably Infinity War and Endgame. I think Infinity War is great on its own. I think Endgame ruined some of that stuff, and so I give Endgame a lower rating. I don't know what the third one, what's going to happen in the third one, so I can't make an informed decision per se. I think what we have so far is good, though, because it's implied there will be consequences. If those consequences actually end up occurring, then that's a different question. So,
Sure. I mean, yeah, and that's broad brush strokes for sure. I think in regards especially to who he is as a person, though, you see him especially at the beginning or of the first one. He's really struggling with the idea of the Matrix. What is the Matrix is a big question in the first film. At this point, he's come to accept that this is the Matrix. He's come to accept he is the one, and he is now basically doing things to the nth degree in regards to infiltrating the Matrix and using it to his own will whenever he's involved, right? You see that when he's flying around, and they make the joke about him acting like Superman, right? Because he can have the power to move through space and time in the Matrix as he wills, because he can manipulate the Matrix. And this is more or less, he's like God-powered in regards to what he can do in this film compared to what he was doing even in the last one. Do you think that provides a good baseline for him as a character, as he has, new threats, different threats in this one compared to the previous one? And do you think he has new threats or different threats?
I think like his goals are threefold, right? And they're in conflict with each other. He's trying to protect Trinity, trying to protect Zion, trying to discover who exactly the one is, if that makes sense. I think they do a good job of having him struggle through these, I guess. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but like, I think they give him decent enough development in this film to have him not necessarily change as a character, but stay true to who he was at the beginning, even throughout the decisions he is faced with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that and maybe this is where I have diverged from your rating of this film specifically, but I think that a lot of my problems with this film specifically come from how Neo is portrayed as a character in this one. And I think, especially in comparison to the last one, you have a lot of this struggle in the first one about him struggling with what the Matrix is, what his role is, all of these other things. All of that idea of discovering what is going on and who he's supposed to be is in some ways, I think, sidelined for the sake of this love interest in this one. And you see that to the degree that even when basically any time that he's alone with Trinity, he's trying to mac on her, right? And he doesn't want to be anywhere besides next to Trinity. And so when you see these other scenes where he's supposed to be, for example, this Messiah figure who's supposed to take care of these other people, he doesn't really want to be there. He doesn't really seem to show any specific care or for concern for the people of Zion other than what he feels obliged to do, right? And so the idea that he is like, and I think this is important more so because he is portrayed as the one, right? And in this one, he's somewhat accepted that role, but then everything else gets sidelined for the sake of love. And the problem I guess I have with it is it seems like his role as the one is an assumed role, something that they don't really develop or harp on beyond just assuming, oh yes, he is the one, so of course he's going to save humanity because that's what he's supposed to do as the one. And his role there is like, I mean, I guess, yeah, I'll do that because I'm here right now, that's what I'm going to do. But honestly, any development for him as a character solely comes around this idea of, oh, is Trinity going to live? Oh, I need to save Trinity. And I think that that takes the primary goal of like the series and like how he's been acting in the first one, and even how the plot itself goes to fight the machines is kind of sidelined in regards to emotional stakes, if that makes sense. Do you disagree with that? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think that you have this idea of fighting against the machines, but Neo, if you remember initially in the first movie, like that wasn't necessarily his goal. He just got thrown into it. And so this movie is the true question of, does he actually care about this goal? Or is Neo just a person who wants to have some sort of emotional connection to the real world? And like, that's also the question they have for the one guy who ends up, I forget his name, in the first movie, who turns back, is like,
Cypher, yeah.
The real world sucks. And so to Neo, the thing that makes the real world worth living in and worth saving and worth fighting for is having a human connection there. And so in a way, Trinity represents everything that he's fighting to save, because he is still human. He's inherently a selfish creature in the sense that he wants something for himself, right? He doesn't want like power or prestige or wealth. He wants this human relationship with Trinity. And so absent that, why keep fighting, right? To a lesser, I don't know if it's a lesser or a more degree, but it's like everyone else also is fighting for their relatives and their family, like their loved ones, right? He doesn't have family. His loved one is Trinity, and he's got like a friendly relationship with Morpheus and the people of his crew to an even lesser extent, but Trinity is what matters most to him. And so in a movie in which you're dealing with questions of what is real and what isn't, and what makes living life worthwhile when you could live in an idealized world but it be fake, then you have to ask, all right, what makes the real world worth it? And so Trinity, I think, represents that. And so I think that his struggle with Trinity and discovering who the one is and trying to continue this fight with the AI that is controlling the Matrix is a very good way of keeping him invested, but also forcing him to come to terms with, like, what am I willing to give up for the rest of humanity or give up for this fight?
Yeah, and I will say, like, in regards to the very end of the film, I would say that, like, his struggle really comes to a head at the very end. But throughout the most of the film, I would argue that that's not necessarily the case. And your point about Trinity is definitely apt to some degree, except for that they don't really necessarily make that connection in this film of this idea that his connection to the real world is contingent on this emotional connection with Trinity. Partially because anytime you see it, it's more of a infatuation with this woman, and that's like all you can focus on. And it's not like we are seeing him say, well, in order for this to continue, I need to basically have Trinity. And also, let me just say, like, as another side point, a lot of this goes into a secondary critique that I have with this, is that the fight scenes themselves are excessively long, in my opinion. They are multi-scene at fights where you have multiple people fighting the same people over the course of 20 or 30 minutes before they move on to the next area where they proceed to fight them again for another 20 or 30 minutes. And I don't know that that necessarily is conducive to building the emotional stakes, because you are sitting there wondering, okay, why are we still fighting these same people? First we were fighting them in this house, then we were fighting them in this garage, now we're fighting them on the freeway, now we're fighting them somewhere else. Like, I think that you get lost in the sauce in regards to emotional stakes.
Sure. I mean, I had a similar critique with the first one. I think the fight in the end of the first one was excessive too. It was just like lots of fight scenes. It is ironic that the Keanu Reeves movies that we've reviewed so far have had excessive fight scenes, but I guess everyone loves to see it.
The precursor to John Wick, everyone saw this like, oh, what if the entire movie was just fight scenes?
Yeah. And what if we gave Keanu Reeves better hair? I think I do want to preface this, by the way. I myself did not find this movie particularly enjoyable. I have yet to find the Matrix movies like movies that I would go, oh yes, I would like to watch that with you. Let's sit down and spend 2 hours doing so. Like, I still think it was a good enough movie to warrant this rating. It just wasn't a movie that I personally enjoyed. Like, the concept of the Matrix and humanity fighting against it is interesting. I think the fights bog it down. I thought the fights bogged it down in the first one. I thought they bogged it down in this one as well. And it's like, don't get me wrong, I like a good fight scene. I especially like when a fight scene is building the plot, or it is a plot. It's a function within the plot, right? And I think great examples of this are fights like the duel on Mustafar between Anakin and Obi-Wan. Like, this is the culmination of two friends and the fall of not only a republic, but the idea that, like, friends are no longer human in your mind. They are more or less just an idea that you see, and an idea that needs to be challenged. And so that fight is a culmination of that. And you get it in both the very idea of the fight existing as well as the setting of where the fight takes place, which is a literal, like, volcanic planet. Fight scenes for the sake of fight scenes, I'm not so much a fan of. And if they are just a fight scene that's like, oh, it makes sense to have a fight scene here, then the fight scene shouldn't take that long, right? And you get this in movies like Gladiator. The Gladiator fights are not necessarily that long if it's just for the sake of having a gladiator fight. And that's not to say, like, we are literally just taking a detour to have a fight. It makes sense for a fight to be at this point in the story, so we're going to show it, but we're not going to dwell on it. I think the Matrix movies will dwell on those fights for a really long time. And especially with, like, the car chase one, that one just felt like it dragged on, and there was, like, ups and downs all throughout that fight until Neo shows up, and then the fight's over. So, just want to get that out there. I think the movie's good enough that it gets I'd probably, if I were just to rate it myself, I'd give it, like, a 7, not a 7.3.
That's not that different.
Yeah.
If that speaks to, like, enjoyability, like, if that speaks to your own enjoyability of the film, that's, like, still a fairly enjoyable film.
Well, no. I mean, like, in terms of trying to objectively rate it, I would probably have put it as 7, because above a 7 is like, this is a phenomenal film, and I don't think I've ever given a film above a 7 that I myself did not have great enjoyment from. So, that's why. I still think it hits all the marks in terms of a main character who has development, a side character or side characters who have development, building towards a greater goal within the plot, increasing tensions. The dialogue, I had a little bit of question with. I'm going to take Maverick's word for it that I am just a Protestant, so I don't understand the verbiage that's being used. So I also don't really have a question. There's not really a question in there for dialogue, so that didn't really go towards my rating.
Yeah, I mean, that would almost go into a discussion we had previously about, in my opinion, revelations, right? And revelations can affect the stakes and the believability and the enjoyability of the film, whether or not you think that things are getting worse because of how they spoke about things. Sure, that can affect it, but it's not in and of itself a killer for the film. Just like a revelation doesn't make or break a film, but it can add to the stakes of the film. So, and in regards to this one, I think they do have that.
Yeah.
And this is maybe like my critique of things is like, just like you said, in regards to the fight scene that we have partway through. In this meandering story, you have this idea that Neo is trying to figure out how to now fight the, more or less the AI, the Matrix controller, with the machines that are connected on the back end. And his role to do that is he has to go to the Oracle. And he goes to the Oracle, and when he finally finds her, it goes, oh, well, you need to find the Keymaster. And then when you find the Keymaster, then you can find this back door. And then when you find the back door, you can interact with the machine. And then when you interact with the machine, hopefully you can defeat it, unplug it, whatever it is, so that humanity can then escape the Matrix and actually survive as a whole, rather than being completely subservient to the machines, right? That's the idea of this story. Throughout all of that, you have a lot of fight scenes, you have a lot of interactions with characters, but a lot of them don't necessarily end with things getting worse per se, right? You only have really like two things going on. I mean, for one, you have them fighting a lot, and then you have Neo show up, and then most of the time he ends up making it out of there. You know, they end up surviving, or people we don't even really know die, right? But like for the most part, our main characters don't really suffer, except for the one time where Neo ends up giving Seraphine, I think is the girl's name, basically the love interest of one of the other machines, decides that she wants a real kiss, and so she says, Neo, you need to give this to me, otherwise I'm not going to give you the keymaker. And so that's what he does. And that was like one moment of stakes where he has to make a decision that goes, oh shoot, should I really be kissing this girl that I don't love for the sake of the mission? And then basically he does. Other than that, like, I think that most of those stakes are pretty much, I didn't feel concerned that the protagonist was going to not make it out of these, or that they were not going to achieve the mission, partially because I don't think that was ever brought up as even really a concern. I mean, most of the current concern basically goes around Trinity, whether or not she will live, and then will Zion be destroyed. But all of the fights within the Matrix themselves are never brought up even as like a concern by the characters. They just do the fights.
This is almost like a Superman situation where Neo is basically a god within the Matrix.
Yeah.
So you don't really, it's impossible to have a fight scene, at least as I see it, unless you introduce another godlike character within the Matrix, in which you really can have fear about characters losing. And so, when I'm watching this film, I'm not necessarily seeing the tension increase from the fight scenes being won or lost. I'm seeing the tension increase from Neo's perspective of he's approaching the inevitability of losing Trinity. And so the question then becomes, what is that going to look like? And so I think having him forced to choose between Zion and Trinity towards the end because of this vision is crucial, which is also why I'm really emphasizing, like, I don't know what the next movie is going to look like, and I don't know what the consequence of saving Trinity will be, given that he was told explicitly, if you save Trinity, Zion dies. So
yeah, well, and in regards to that last point, I will agree, and we'll get to that because I think that deserves its own discussion, that big revelation at the end of the film. But in regards to, I think, the fight scenes, you said, the fight scenes aren't necessarily as concerning because he's a Superman-esque character, and it's more of the plod toward the inevitable death of Trinity, which is going to occur. Which then begs the question, what is the point of the fight scenes? Like, if you're not actually concerned that anyone's going to die, it's like, well, then why are they fighting?
Well, I mean, I think also to an extent the fight scenes serve as this question of, is this when Trinity's going to die? Rather than, is this a risk for us losing this fight, per se? The truck one, I agree. I think it's kind of useless since it's broad daylight and it's a completely different setting than the scene we see at the beginning. Then again, we do see some weird stuff with doors early on, so there's always a chance she goes through some door and ends up in that setting. I mean, you're not going to get a disagreement with me in regards to the fight scenes being long and drawn out and unnecessary at that point. Aside from, like, yeah, they're obviously going to have fights. I just don't think they needed to be as long as they were.
Sure. Well, and I think my point is that we're talking about a 2 hour and 15-minute long film, and of that, at least an hour of it, if not more, is just fighting. And if those are not serving the plot, in a tangible way, I think that we have to question why they're there, or like what the purpose was for having them in the film. And I think that they detract from the film. I think that they do not add to it. I think they actually take away from it and cause us to not focus on the things that are important, such as, for example, the sacrifice of Trinity, which then becomes critical at the end. And so it's like you have this thing at the beginning, the vision at the beginning, which is good. They have this whole like, oh, we are all humans and we are living and experiencing life, and at the very beginning as well. And you're like, okay, well, whatever. And then it's all trying to say like, this is humanity and this is worth fighting for, maybe. And then you proceed to fight for, an hour and 15 minutes. And then you finally get to the end where things, I think, get interesting again. And it just makes me wonder, what was the point of a good portion of this film?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's weird because I think the film still functions in the way that it should. And I think you could cut down the movie probably like a solid 30 minutes at least. And you'd still have what you need in order to get from point A to point B. I'm just struggling to think in terms of like, okay, I give this film a 7 because I think it hits all the marks. It has a bunch of extra fluff in there. Does the fluff make the rest of it bad? If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would say that it does. I would say that the fight scenes actively detract from what's at stake. I would not just say that it's extra fluff. I would say that, like, when you have there's the whole idea of, like, writing tension, right? The idea that when you have tension, you can also break that tension by doing things. For example, humor is a perfect example of this. Like, too much humor in an action-packed film can take away from the action, can take away from the tension, because you're no longer focused on, oh my goodness, is this person going to die? Why? Because the character's not taking the scene seriously. And if the character's not taking the scene seriously, how are we as audience supposed to take the scene seriously, right? And so there's things like that, where something can be inserted into the film for one purpose, entertainment, comedy, whatever you will, and it can actively detract from what you're trying to do when it comes to raising the stakes, getting us concerned for the protagonists or whatever is going on, and be concerned that they might actually survive or not. Because we're dealing with, one, a Superman-esque character, and two, we're dealing with goals that I think are not clearly defined for why they're even in the Matrix, I think that it detracts from the point of what's going on. It felt like for a good portion of the film, we were dealing with a Star Wars Episode 8 side tangent where they go off to this random gambling city to figure out some sort of goal here. That's kind of what the Keymaker side plot felt like, until they finally brought it back at the end with the doors, and he opens the door for them. So I think, I mean, I think I've said my piece in regards to that. In regards to Neo, his character, we'll get to, I think, right now, which is appropriate, because all of that, as much as I critique that, it comes to the point where he gets inside of the door with the help of the Keymaker. And at that spot, he meets this character known as the Architect. And the Architect then reveals to Neo that the One is a design of the Matrix, that Neo has been intentionally created to help stop what is known as basically the crash of the Matrix, where this idea of free will more or less exists, that humanity has free will and the machines cannot remove it from them. And eventually, if the Matrix is allowed to exist and run over an extended period of time, enough people with their free will determine that the Matrix is not real, that it is fake, and this will cause a cascade of effects that will eventually result in the crashing of the Matrix, and it will fall. Basically, everyone, it will not work for the machines. They cannot let that happen. And so what they have to do is this periodic, more or less, purging, if you will, which is what they use the One for, to help reset the Matrix, to put everything right, to destroy, more or less, Zion, but then rebuild it with the will of the Chosen One, who then helps to rebuild society, to have this idea that the people who are fighting have something to fight for. What are your thoughts on that revelation in this story?
I think it's interesting, the idea that, like, Neo as the One is this reoccurring... He's not really a program, unless I'm getting that wrong. But he is a part of
it's a system
cycle. Yeah.
Right.
I'm still a little confused as to why Trinity has to die, and maybe you could enlighten me as to that, but wasn't super clear. I feel like this film, another way that it struggles is either I feel like I get too much exposition or not enough throughout the film, in terms of we're going to explicitly lay out exactly what we think and what's going to happen, or we're not going to say jack squat and let you figure it out yourself.
Yeah. And it's a little bit weird because the way that the architect talks about everything, it's in the same tone of voice. And so you don't necessarily get, unless you're listening closely, that he is actually making a distinction necessarily between this Neo and previous Neos, and or previous the ones, if you will. And what he says in the middle of this monologue is he goes, we have had the one as part of the system this entire time. The Oracle is part of this system. The Keymaker is part of this system. And you too are part of this system to help to remake the Matrix every number of years to cause this to happen. And he said the one interesting thing, I guess, if you will, of this iteration of the one, you, Neo, is that you have a love that is not necessarily tied to humanity. And he said that the general good of humanity is what has driven the past ones to accept the decision here in this moment and to end up remaking the Matrix for the sake of the survival of humanity rather than their absolute obliteration when Zion gets destroyed. In this case, the architect basically says you have this unique connection to a woman who is outside of the Matrix, who drives you maybe more than a love for humanity. And his concern, which he basically says is a foregone conclusion, is that you will reject the call that every other one has accepted and choose to try to save a singular person rather than save all of humanity. And he says it's a foolish gamble, you shouldn't do it, but you're going to do it anyways. And of course, that is what Neo does, is he ends up leaving the architect's room back into the world that he had previously existed in the Matrix and goes off to save Trinity. That's more or less the unique aspect that Thomas Anderson, aka Neo, brings to the table. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that change your thoughts on that scene specifically?
No, I just needed like an explanation as to why this is the impossible decision placed before him. I think the revelation's good because it brings into contrast or conflict now his goal of like, okay, this burden of the one has been placed on me. You even get that with that one guy that he saved, that he's like, I didn't want to save that guy. I don't know why I'm saving this guy. Or not why I'm saving this guy. I don't know why he keeps coming back to me. Like, he doesn't want this responsibility. And so when he's forced to decide between a responsibility he doesn't want and a woman he does, to him, it's almost a no-brainer. He's like, he also is kind of high on his own, not ego, that's not the word I'm trying to look for, but like, the fact, like, he's high on the knowledge that he's basically a god in the Matrix, and so he almost feels like he could avoid either one, so he's going to prioritize Trinity here. And so he's obviously going to choose her in that moment, and I think the revelation's good, because now it puts him in a bind where it's like, you can either accept and embrace this role you've been investigating this whole time, or you can revert back to just saving this woman that has been a distraction for you, and like both figuratively and literally throughout this film.
And I think that in regards to Revelations, it's good not just because it forces him to make this really tough decision, but also because in some ways it changes our understanding of everything that's happened previously, right? And so our understanding of even the first film gets reframed in this one, because you realize that everything that happened in that one in some ways was also architected by the more or less controlling programs, even if individual programs didn't know about it, say for example the agents, or there was other elements that were intentionally built for that purpose, such as the Oracle, such as the Keymaker, and all of these things that have happened as designed by the machines. So it puts you in a situation of going, oh, he's just winning so easily, to this idea of, oh, well, that was intended that he would win because they needed that in order to remake the Matrix as is designed. So I think in regards to Revelations is really good. And in some ways you can use that as an excuse to then say, well, that's why the fight scenes earlier were so easy. I still think that's poor writing, but, that aside, I think that the idea that this scene is very good for a reason. My only real beef, I guess, with it is that Neo, and you touched on this, that he's more of like a White Knight character in this one. I'm not even like entirely convinced that he falls into that category per se, just because I don't think you get any real reflection from Neo at any point in this film until this moment. All he is basically, oh, I love this woman, I want to be with this woman, and then he's with her all the time, and then he comes to this moment and goes, oh shoot, I can save this woman, or I can save humanity, I'm going to save this woman, which at this point is assumed by us as that's what he would do. So I don't really think that his character arc is really compelling in this one. I think that there's not really a ton that he has to struggle with, only except for going, oh shoot, in that moment, and then goes back to doing what he was going to do anyways. I think there is a lot to be had in regards to Neo in this one compared to the previous one, and even compared to the next one, which we will get to. But I think that he is much less compelling for a reason, and a lot of this because he isn't reflective in this one as he was in the previous one. So, also that being said, the ability for him to just save Trinity and bring her back to life, do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, it makes sense with his abilities. I literally asked when we were watching the scene, why doesn't he do this? Like, I feel like this should be a no-brainer. So, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the only thing. I'm not going to say it was bad per se. It's better than the kiss in the first one, I will say that. But in regards to the him just bringing her back to life, in some ways it just cheats the promise of dread, if you will, from the beginning, where there wasn't really necessarily consequences from that. Now, the consequences of him making that decision, maybe we'll see what that goes to later on, but I'm just going to say, not that it's a killer for me, but I just didn't personally think it was that strong of an element. So,
yeah.
That being said, that's a lot on Neo, on the arc of it as a whole. What are your thoughts on the villains, since we've kind of touched on them already? What are your thoughts on the architect and the AI as a whole, the agents? What are your thoughts?
I do feel like the Agent Smith kind of got a little less intimidating as he was in the last film. Or not maybe Smith, but just the agents in general. I don't know that I hate them. It felt like the natural progression of like, oh, we've discovered there is an agent. There's got to be somebody above this. Okay, that's the architect. Cool. It didn't feel like this massive revelation, though, if that makes sense.
The architect specifically, or what are you talking about?
Like, just the existence of a higher artificial intelligence.
Yeah, no, and I think that the architect is more of like an example of a powerful explanation being. I think that the idea that he is super powerful is probably one of the better parts of this film, and I think that he is overshadowed by the fight scenes once again, so maybe not as intriguing as the rest of them. I think Agent Smith was interesting in his development in this one. It's more so in his fighting. I think his lines were a lot more interesting in the first one, as he talks about this more or less struggle to be free as a machine, rather than just like humanity wants to be free. And in this one, he just talks about, oh, well, now I am free, and he has this ability to more or less overwrite things that agents previously were not able to overwrite. So he can not just take over other bodies, but he can duplicate himself in other bodies, and he can even take over bodies from people who are free from the Matrix, and then enter the real world as in the conscious mind of someone else. Like, that has interesting implications, and you see some implications from that later in the film when you realize that he caused an EMP to launch, more or less, or what do you call it, like detonate, I guess, so that all of the machines went down and got destroyed in a fight that happens off screen, right? You realize that happened by Agent Smith. So there are interesting developments in regards to some of these things. Do they really terminate in anything in this one? Not really. So once again, kind of a middle of the road aspect for me in regards to the villains. Yeah, with that being said, I don't know if you have thoughts on specific characters. As always, I think Morpheus deserves a mention. What are your thoughts on him in this one, especially in compared to the previous film?
I mean, he pretty much just continues this arc of being this devout believer in Neo. Like, there's not much change there. And you just see it kind of terminate in different ways in this movie. You get to see his the friction that's created between him and the leadership at Zion as a result of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and you also get a revelation, and I forget if he gets to that revelation. I think he does in this one, where he realizes that even his undying belief was in some ways a design of the Matrix itself as well, where they want people like him to push forward to find the one, and then push them to recreate the Matrix and basically rebuild it every couple of decades or whatever it is something that is in some ways shows that even him and his undying devotion to this cause is being used just like everyone else was being used by the Matrix. So, I mean, once again, not nuanced or new compared to the previous version of him, but also adds an interesting light to who he is as a character, and even for the implications of what will he do in the next film.
Yeah.
So, yeah, with that being said, what are your thoughts on Trinity in this one, Andrew? She is much more front and center in this film compared to the previous one. Do you think she's a compelling side character? I mean, she's a huge motivation for Neo.
I think she does a lot less in this film, all things considered. She does make the decision at the end to go into the Matrix anyways. Other than that, I feel like she doesn't get really that much development at all, other than she's a love interest for Neo.
Once again, I agree. I think it's one of the problems of this film. It's like, I think we took a lot of characters from the first film, you know, Neo, Trinity, Morpheus, and they have these beliefs, ideas, understandings at the beginning of the film, and they carry through to the end of this film just with more action and a big revelation at the end of it. So, I mean, I think the goals of where they were trying to go with this were good, especially for that revelation. But the way that we got around to that does make me question the necessity of a lot of this film. And even going back to what you said in the first one, right? What if they had taken the first film and they had two very different ideas, right? Escaping the Matrix, and then the need to be the chosen one. And you talked about this idea of, well, what if they just split the first film into two separate films and developed some of these ideas more? This film in some ways makes me question whether or not that would have been the right route, right? Because you could have taken some of those ideas in that second half of what does it mean to be the one and fully developed it, adding in that big revelation at the end of this one, right? Then made it a more interesting, delving question that is discussed throughout the entire film rather than the fighting that we got. Do you disagree with that? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know that I necessarily disagree. I'm just having trouble with the overall rating of this film, simply because of the idea that, like, I don't know, like I said earlier, it covers all of the points that it needs to, in my mind, even though it has a lot of unnecessary fluff in there at the same time. And so the question is, does the unnecessary fluff counteract the good that it does in terms of hitting all of the points that a plot needs in order to succeed, if that makes sense? Do I think the movie was necessary and it could have been merged with the first one? Probably. I just don't know if that makes this movie a bad movie as opposed to an unnecessary one, if that makes sense.
Well, I think the idea that you can or could potentially merge this one with the previous one, or at least extend the first one into this one more, does question a lot of the viability of this film. But second off, like I also, in case I wasn't clear, disagree with some of the points that this hits all of the points of what makes a good film. I
Sure,
don't think the
yeah.
characters are developed well. I don't think the tension is developed well. I think that the villains are mediocre in this one, especially compared to the previous one. And I think that there is a reason that it got a 3.1 from me. So I think that I think my conclusion on this is clear, but in regards to how you're struggling with it, I think I see where you're coming from. I just don't think that the points that you say are there are actually there.
Sure. I mean, just to run down my notes, right? Opener, I thought was solid. I didn't give it full points. The entering the frame and Neo's goals and struggles in this film, I think, are pretty solid. Not like 100% there, but I think everything that needs to be there is there for his character. In terms of like all three of the goals that I stated earlier, his internal conflict, it's consistently tested in terms of like him constantly questioning like when is this dream going to occur, and like this thought of Trinity is on his mind. You have like the themes I think are pretty spot on still. I think I don't really have a doubt that they'll be any less so in the third film. The stakes, like you don't really have stakes in terms of Neo. You have stakes in terms of Zion, and you have stakes in terms of Trinity. You don't really get any massive loss there. But I think the villains as a whole still function quite decently. Like Agent Smith is this almost philosophical counterforce. The Machine is meant, especially post the revelation, it's like this inevitability they're fighting against, and the Architect builds into that. I keep thinking back to like episode 1 when I'm thinking about this film, because I think episode 1 is also completely unnecessary, but I don't think it's just unnecessary. I think it's also just a bad film in terms of the character's actual progression. And maybe I just have to stew on this film for a little bit more to come to that same conclusion, because I think it's like this film is either like a 7 or maybe like a 6, somewhere in between there. I'm not going to say those two numbers in that order. It's between there, like somewhere around a 6.5, or it's like a 2 for me. Like it's somewhere in between those two, because it just depends on this question in my mind of, is it just unnecessary, or is it unnecessary and a bad film? Whereas like episode 1, I came to the conclusion that not only is it unnecessary, it's a bad film, because I think episode 1 doesn't necessarily drive forward the plot of the overall like Skywalker saga, if you will, of movies 1 through 6. I think it's not only unnecessary in terms of that, I think it's also just a bad film in terms of it as a standalone story. So,
Sure, yeah. And in regards to if I were to maybe rephrase that in my wording, right? Does this film progress the storyline of the Matrix series as a whole? To some degree, yes. Does it function well as a standalone film? I would say not at all. But I also understand that it's not meant to be a standalone film. Obviously, the next one comes out like a literal 6 months after this one comes out. So they had in mind that there would be a third one. So I don't necessarily fault it for not standing on its own. I think that more or less a lot of the functions in the middle of it garner whether or not the way that, not that the story shouldn't be told, but the way that the story was told was just bad.
sure. And I think with 1, it's like, because it's the beginning of a trilogy, there's a lot more reason that it should be able to stand on its own. And instead of like, and if it isn't building towards the greater goals of the trilogy, it's not like it has to in every way, right? Like Pirates 1 doesn't necessarily build towards in like every way, if that makes sense, towards like the greater goals of 2 and 3, even though it does to an extent. Like the groundwork is there so that when you get to 2 and 3, all of the groundwork has been laid. And I think that's what the first one should do. It should function as a film that can be a standalone, but does a lot of the groundwork that a trilogy or future movies would need in order to be made, if that makes sense. Such as like just establishing characters and world building and like where are we, what are we, who are we, those sort of questions. And so it's like, it's hard not to progress a trilogy when you're the second movie out of 3. And if you're not, then you're just a really bad movie at that point. So
right.
I think, yeah, I mean, I'm just between those 2 points at this point in time. The 2 and like the 6.5.
I see what you're saying now. In regards to the themes which you touched on just briefly, what are your thoughts on those? Do you think the themes are compelling in this film?
I think they're good. I like this idea of like there's the illusion of choice or determinism versus free will, or like you're predestined to go through this because this is an algorithm. And then you also get like within that you get like these cycles of rebellion too. Like you're just humanity will always rebel. There will always be a vacuum, and the AI will be there to take its place. So I think the themes are pretty spot on. I mean, to the extent that they're quite literally just explaining them at certain points.
Yeah, and I think especially this goes back to that revelation scene actually being quite good, because it does take some of these themes and puts them, in the spotlight head on, as you discuss them, as you think about them. I mean, other than that scene, I wish some of those were discussed more in the film. Once again, less fighting, more actual discussion of things. But other than that, the main one that is discussed is this idea of more or less the power of love and how that is going to continually influence the main character's decision in this film. So that one is developed for sure very well, and then the other ones are brought up as a significant point, especially by the end. But no, the themes aren't bad, and I think that they are actually very interesting, and in some ways are a interesting side tangent on this discussion of being human versus being a machine. What does that mean, and what are the consequences of that, right? So
yeah,
for sure.
I am surprised, by the way, because I've heard the third film was the worst, but it sounds like that one might be your favorite, considering you haven't seen the fourth, and you said this one is your least favorite, and the first one you said wasn't your favorite. So I'm a bit confused here, but I guess we'll see when we watch the third one.
Yeah, I will say, it's been a minute since I watched the third one. I recalled enjoying the third one the most, but...
Okay.
I do not, that might change, I might come back next week and be like, number 3, I gave it a 1.5.
I give it a negative 0.9.
Oh, geez. We're getting down to Thor Love and Thunder level.
It's interesting. I've never thought about giving a film a negative rating, but I definitely would have given films like Joker, Foyer Adieu, and Star Wars Episode 9, and Thor Love and Thunder, and the Mufasa movie. Like, those 4 movies off the top of my head are probably like the worst of the films that we've reviewed.
Yeah. It didn't help that some of those were, reviewed
Captain
right
America,
after.
Brave New World would definitely be down there too. But sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, yes, those were terrible films. With that being said, what are your thoughts on this film and how it concluded? Are you satisfied with it? And do you think there will be a lasting impact to this film?
So, I've had to do a lot of thinking about these cliffhanger endings, because I remember when we reviewed, was it Across the Spider-Verse? And I did not like the way that it ended because of the cliffhanger. And then I also thought about it some more with movies like Infinity War, where it ends on a cliffhanger, but you still have resolution within the film, right? Infinity War ends, but Thanos is also still won. So it's not necessarily a cliffhanger, aside from the fact that the Marvel fans know Marvel would never kill off that many characters all at once. And we also knew we were getting a follow-up movie. So like we going into that film, we knew there was going to be a second movie. We knew the story wasn't over. But like there's still resolution to that, right? The whole conflict is, can we stop Thanos? They don't stop Thanos. This film ends on a cliffhanger. I don't know if I like the cliffhanger though. I'm just a little conflicted. I mean, to an extent, right? They still resolve the conflict of the film, which is what is Neo going to choose, Trinity or Zion? Is Trinity going to die, right? Those are like, it's first, is Trinity going to die? Who is the one? Can I protect Zion? Those are the three questions Neo has. By the end of the film, he decides, I'm saving Trinity. I know who the one is now. He's part of this algorithm or this repeating process that occurs because of the architect and the way that the algorithm is designed or programmed. And then he also decides, like, if it comes down to it, I'll save Trinity over Zion. The question we're left unanswered with is, can he protect Zion now? And that's what the third film is going to tackle. So I think there's enough resolution for the film to still resolve that cliffhanger to where it's not like I'm as disappointed as I was with Across the Spider-Verse, where it's like we didn't get the resolution that we wanted. We merely got a repetition of the same arc that Miles Morales went through in the first movie, and now we're just leaving it on a cliffhanger for cliffhanger's sake. Like it felt like the ending to a TV episode as opposed to a movie, in which you want people to actually leave the theater with some semblance of not closure per se, but like resolution to some of the questions that were posed in that film. So anyways, yeah, I've just been thinking about that a lot because, like, all right, we don't like some cliffhangers, but we're okay with others, and I think that's why. It's just the question of, does the cliffhanger still resolve some of the conflict that we had while introducing new conflict by the, like, in the sense that we are getting a cliffhanger here and more an unresolved conflict, right?
Yeah, and this is me just thinking off the top of my head, right? But I think maybe some of that dissonance comes from this idea of the primary conflict. And does the primary conflict get at least furthered and put into a spot where there is some level of closure to it, even if it's not completely done, if that makes sense. And you get that for some degree, for example, with Infinity War. At the end, it's not like we are at any doubt that there will be a sequel to that film. But in that one, you also have a clear ending to that conflict. The Avengers lose, right? And we know that the Avengers have lost. In another example, for example, Star Wars Episode 5, you get the idea of, sure, they're in this fight against the Empire. The rebellion is losing, right? They have lost a key character. Luke has got this big revelation. Like, there is a lot of these things about what the Empire means and what they have to be doing going forward has been resolved as you get to that point. Now, there's still questions of what will Luke do now that he knows that his father is the big bad guy known as Darth Vader and things like that. But it doesn't mean that there is not some completion to that arc. Right. Yeah. In regards to, say, some of these other films, I think maybe that's where this one feels a little dissonant, because you don't actually see if Zion gets destroyed. You don't see what happens to humanity. And the big question about this is this fight against humanity and the machines. And instead, you get the B plot resolved, which is this question about Trinity and Neo and whether or not he will choose his love over his fight for humanity. And that gets resolved very clearly in this one. But then what happens as a result of that? What will happen to humanity? I guess you could make the assumption that humanity gets destroyed, but that would be a bit presumptuous, I would say, because we don't actually know what's going to happen. All we know is that he's going back to Zion and that there's a bad guy stowaway with him as they return.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm not fully convinced that that's the answer. That's just me thinking off the top of my head. We'll have to analyze that going forward as we watch future films. But it is interesting to think about, is that the reason that the B-plot was resolved and there was not really any conclusion or any satisfying bookmark, if you will, in the main plot? Maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that that's interesting. Other than that, this film was successful at its time to a huge degree, which was surprising to me to do the research and realize that this was the highest grossing R-rated film of all time until 2016 when Deadpool came out. So this was definitely a box office hit, to say the least. I mean, it cost 127 to 150 million to create, and then garnered 741 million in the box office. So by no means did they not make money off of this, and I'm sure that they continued to make money in the next one, which we will get to at the next time. But it was successful. It's an interesting discussion to see that even though it was so successful, there was some serious critiques going on here. Is that valid? Is that not? You can leave comments on the episode, I guess. We'll probably disagree with you, but that's what this episode was for. So, anyways, that's all we got for today. We hope you all enjoyed, because we will be back, as we always are, next week. We'll see you all then.